So good day, friends. This is Dr. Bob Hamilton, and you have tuned in today to the Hamilton Review, where kids and culture collide. Every time you tune in, it means a lot to me because I know you. You guys are friends of mine, many of you, and families. And I know who you are. I know what you're doing every day. You're busy people. You're chasing children. You're driving grandchildren. You're trying to keep up with life. And the fact that you tuned in today means a lot to me. And I will tell you that, we are growing an audience. If you like what you hear, tell people about the show. I think we're bringing great people to you, and today is going to be a very special day. We have an amazing guest who I'm going to I have two guests. One of them is my daughter, Emily, who has interviewed with me before. Emily, do you want to say hi?
Yes. Hello, everyone.
So Emily is actually the person who alerted me to our guest of the day, who is Dr. Michael Goran. And he is one of the recognized experts in child nutrition and obesity around the world. He's been at this for 30 years. As a researcher, mentor, and educator, he's a professor of pediatrics at USC. Keck School of Medicine. He's the co-director of the USC Diabetes and Obesity Research Institute, and he leads the program in diabetes and obesity at Children's Hospital, LA. He is the Robert C. and Veronica Atkins Endowed Chair in Childhood Obesity and Diabetes. He's a native of Glasgow, Scotland, and received his PhD from the University of Manchester in Britain. So, Dr. Michael Goran, you're an accomplished man. It is such an honor to have you here today on the Hamilton Review.
Great to be here. Thanks for taking an interest and bringing me on the show and getting the word out. Thank you for all you're doing.
Absolutely. You're totally welcome. And I do want to mention, by the way, before I go too far, that Michael is the author, along with Emily Ventura, his co-writer of a book that is entitled Sugarproof. We're going to put this book out on the Instagram, but the subtitle is Protect Your Family from the Hidden Dangers of Excess Sugar with Simple Everyday Fixes. The book, again, is called Sugarproof. You can buy it on Amazon. Fabulous book. We'll talk about that in some detail. But Michael, before we dive into all of your research and everything, tell us a little bit about who you are, your background, where you grew up, a little bit of the points in your life that made you want to do what you're doing today.
Sure. So, yeah, like you mentioned in the introduction, I grew up in Glasgow, Scotland, in the 60s and 70s. And I went to study biochemistry at Manchester University because in school I loved biology and I loved chemistry. So I studied biochemistry. Didn't really know what I was going to do in my life, and I liked being in school, so I decided to do a PhD after that in biochemistry and got very interested in metabolism and understanding how we process food and how that internal processing of food is altered by different things in the environment. So my PhD was actually in animals, studying metabolic response to infection. I learned a lot from that, and one thing I learned clearly was I didn't want to work with rats anymore. I wanted to work with humans. So that time I was in the UK, it was very hard to get work in my area. So I came to the US for a postdoctoral fellowship, for a one-year fellowship in 1987 with my little suitcase in hand. And Galveston, Texas was where I ended up at the Shriners Burns Institute. And I got involved with a very interesting project understanding how children respond metabolically to burn injury and how to optimize their nutrition. And this got me very interested in childhood nutrition and development and how nutrition can help with development. And then I got a second fellowship in Vermont. So I went from Texas to Vermont, one extreme to the other.
Really?
And this is somebody who had never been to the US before. So, I was getting it all. And there I joined a comprehensive research group focused on obesity. but nobody was studying childhood obesity. And, in the late 80s, 1990s, there really wasn't a lot of research going on in obesity and nutrition in children because it wasn't really of concern. So I stuck with that since then, like you said, for over 30 years, almost 35 years, and just watching the field evolve and change not just as kids are becoming heavier, but also as we're seeing adult onset diseases happening in children, like type 2 diabetes, fatty liver disease. We can talk about that later. And, I decided maybe about 10 years ago, I decided I want to write a book. I didn't know what it was going to be on. The idea really was that it became quite apparent that the research I was doing had meaningful information, but the reality is in research, it's kind of a lonely little club. Nobody really reads the research. If you're lucky, you have a paper that is cited 100 times and, 100 people read it. But it seemed to me that I needed to have more than 100 people read it and not just researchers. So I wanted to bring the research to life because it started to tell a very interesting story and a story that was coalescing around how dietary sugar is affecting kids' health specifically, and not just kids, but also adults. And really, as my writing agent drummed into me as I was writing the book, because I'm a science writer, writing very dull research papers, every sentence she said should be news that you can use. And so I really became very focused on trying to bring the research to life in ways that would make it useful for people like Emily with young babies and other parents to be out there who can really take this research and use it in meaningful ways to improve health.
No, and you have done a good job, and I think that sometimes I spent a fair amount of time at UCLA doing my medical school and internship or residency, and you're right. There's a tendency to live in that ivory tower, as we call it, but you have really put your ideas and your research into very readable terms. And I think this is going to be helping, honestly, not hundreds who read your esoteric papers, but literally thousands and hopefully tens of thousands of people will really gain something from this. So there are so many things. I read your book, and not completely. I didn't read through every diet or recipe that you have in here, but I did read a lot of your book, and I have lots of notes. But my daughter Emily also read your book, and what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna actually step away from the mic myself a little bit, and I'm gonna turn the microphone over to Emily because she has a lot of good questions about what you're saying. And basically, friends, Sugarproof is a book about how much sugar there is out in the world and why sugar is good. Obviously, we need that for our cells need sugar, but we're getting too much of it. I think that's the bottom line here. And Emily, I'm going to leave it at that, and I'm going to turn it over to you. So it's up to you, my love.
Okay. Well, it makes sense when your editor told you news to use, because I had 14 pages of notes from reading your book. So I found you on Instagram and I started following, and then I saw the book, and I actually got the book from the Santa Monica Library. And I only got to 6% before I had to turn it off, just shut it down, because I felt like I was reading a scary book or watching a scary movie, because it was so shocking. And I'm someone that really values healthy eating, has a vegetable garden. But I had memories that would come back to me about high school of like, the ice blended mochas I would drink, or the brownies I would eat, or the, even I've been pregnant twice, and you talk about the silent sugar. So anyway, it's been a hugely impactful book. And what I was seeing is there was just a million ways to go. You could go socioeconomical, political, agricultural. There's just the money behind sugar, all that. But I really want to focus on the parenting aspect of how we're supposed to do this as parents. So I would love for you to, I could really read your book back to you because I highlighted so much, but I'd really love for you to talk about these surprising truths. We sort of all know sugar is bad for you, limit sugar. But what was, I would love to hear you talk about just these surprising facts that we sort of don't want to open our eyes to when it comes to sugar.
Yeah, well, I guess quite a list of those. So, I mean, one would be, it's not like Bob mentioned, there's a lot of sugar in the environment. And that's part of it. It's not just that the kids are consuming more sugar, but different types of sugar. Sugar has over 250 different names.
Yes.
And that's on purpose. The food industry is trying to bamboozle us by confusing us with different names for sugar. Some that sound healthy and appealing. That's one thing. Second thing is that kids are, part of this issue is that kids are born with this built-in preference for sweetness.
Right. This
is supposed to be beneficial from an evolutionary perspective to favor breast milk, but that was, that's from prior ancestors where we didn't have the food environment that we have today, where sugar is everywhere. So we have this built-in preference plus this environment where sugar is everywhere. And then the other surprising thing is that there's all these hidden sugars as well in places we don't normally expect it. I mean, I think people are aware of the sugar in soda, but apple juice, fruit juices can have just as much, if not more, sugar. And then there's the foods like breads and crackers and frozen foods and salad dressings and peanut butters and tomato sauces and yogurts, energy bars, the list goes on. So these are the hidden sugars where you wouldn't necessarily expect sugar to be found. And then the last, I could talk all day about this, but not to. But the other thing I was going to say that really kind of lit my fire, in a sense, was my realization on the fact that kids are more vulnerable to the damaging effects of sugar.
Yeah. I mean, something you said is, sugar can disrupt the normal growth of internal organs, including the heart, brain, liver, and gut. And, science is showing that sugar and sweeteners are major players in the symptoms and disorders that have become increasingly common in our children. And that really stops you in your tracks. And I think as parents, you think, oh, it's just a treat. It's something fun. They love it. I see the delight in their eyes. But, reading something like that makes you question, we could figure out a different way to have a treat. And I was talking to my dad yesterday about how, we all know ice cream, cookies, donuts, that's sugar. But what really your book drove home was you all need to understand that you're dosing sugar from the beginning of the day to the end of the day. The breakfast cereal, the granola, the juices, the bars. Yeah, like you said, the pasta sauces, the ketchup, and just really triggering your mind to know, oh my goodness, this hasn't been consolidated to birthday parties. It's your whole day. So that was something that I've remembered since reading the book.
Yeah, it's really nonstop. And the book is not about taking sugar away by any means, like Bob said. I mean, there's a pleasure and a happiness and it's an important part of growing up, but it's not something that we need all day. And the best metaphor I can think of, I talk a little bit about it in the book, is, and this comes back to the name. Where did we get Sugarproof from? So it's a bit like, we know too much sun causes skin cancer, right? That doesn't mean to say we can't take our kids outside and enjoy a day at the beach because we're afraid of skin cancer. We know how to sunproof our kids. And so this is about sugar is damaging. We're not saying you can't have it, but how do we protect you? How do we manage to have our sugary stuff, but not have it like derail our health.
And I thought it was really helpful that you gave the breakdowns of the age of, recommended teaspoons or grams of sugar per day, just so you don't go, you can't eliminate it all. But let's talk about how, families really do want to give their kids healthy snacks. And I think you can go in the grocery store and there's a lot of those fruit pouches or fruit juice, or like you say, low calorie stuff. And when you said something about, the sugar in a fruit juice is almost comparable to a sugar in soda. So what is the myth of these, quote, healthy snacks that are being marketed to us?
Yeah, I could take apple juice as a good example, because, it has a very what we call a health halo around it. It looks and sounds healthy. It's apple juice, but most parents know about high fructose corn syrup and try to avoid it whenever possible. But the reality is that apple juice, the concentration of fructose in apple juice is more than what is in high fructose corn syrup. So that's one thing. So it's not just potentially more sugar, but more fructose, which is the more damaging sugar, especially for kids.
Right. And that's the one that you're like, if you just read this book, you should know that fructose goes right to your liver. And what does it do in the liver?
Well, yeah, and it's a little, and here's where the ambiguity comes, because it's liquid sugar. It's about concentration and the dosage. So a glass of apple juice has the juice from 3 apples. So that's another thing. So we're not talking about the fructose that you would get from eating an apple or another piece of fruit. The fructose that you get from drinking juice it's more of it, and it's more rapidly absorbed. And those things are critical, because it's the high dose and the high rate of absorption that becomes problematic. And that's when it goes straight to the liver, if it's absorbed. It may not be absorbed, in which case you get all kinds of GI issues. If it is absorbed, it goes straight to your liver, and your liver treats it like a toxin and does with it exactly the same thing as it does with alcohol. So people have called fruit juice alcohol without the buzz, because metabolically it's the same thing. The liver detoxifies things that you absorb from your gut, takes out the alcohol, takes out the drugs, takes out any other chemicals or compounds it doesn't want to get to the rest of your body. And one of those compounds that it gets detoxified or removed by the liver, which is a filter, basically, is fructose. And it converts it into fat, just like it converts alcohol into fat. And that fat can either A, build up in the liver and damage the liver and cause it not to work, and that's fatty liver disease, and we can talk about that. Or it's put out back into the circulation as cholesterol and other lipids. That is surprisingly where you get the link between excess sugars and heart disease risk.
Interesting. So when you see something that's 100% fruit juice sweetened, instead of going, oh, great, this is a much healthier option for my kids, you should say, oh, that's still sugar. Doesn't matter.
Yeah, and the bad sugar.
The bad sugar.
Can I interject something real quickly here? Because we're talking about sugar. Obviously, there are foods out there, fruits, and I'm about ready to have an apple for my lunch here. But these are their sugars are natural, and fructose is natural. And I think that we need to clarify that there are a lot of the things that, Emily, you mentioned, like ketchup and other things where there's added sugar. In other words, there's natural sugar in in lots of foods. But your major concern, Michael, it was a thread in your book, was the amount of added sugar that is put into so many of processed foods. I think the number you gave was 70% of processed foods have added sugar. That to me is an important point that we need to share with our listeners.
Yeah, absolutely. These days I'm talking about sugars in the context of the good, the bad, and the ugly.
Mm.
So the apple, that's a good sugar. When you eat the whole fruit, that's a good sugar. Or when you drink milk that doesn't have added sugar. Or the bad is the added sugar. We're focused here on added sugars. Technically, the USDA and the FDA does not call juice added sugar because it's not added, but it's what I call free sugars. It's extracted from the apple, and that process becomes highly concentrated and removes all the fiber and removes all the other phytonutrients. So when you eat that apple for lunch, the fructose is going to be slowly released into your system because it's packaged inside the cell. It's going to have to break down the fibers. Just a very slow release system. Whereas if you drink apple juice, it's like, boom, straight infusion of liquid fructose, which is where it becomes problematic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you for clarifying that.
And it's
Later on, you can ask me what the ugly is. We can talk about that.
Oh yeah, what's the ugly?
The ugly is sweeteners, and that's a whole other conversation. But we should probably talk about it at some point.
Yeah, please. Is that the stevias and the low calorie sweeteners?
Yeah.
Okay, let's do it.
I call those the ugly because, again, from the public, it's seen as a good thing. It's calorie free. It's sugar free. And then from the food industry, it's a great solution for them. The food industry is under a lot of pressure to reduce sugars in foods, and so all they're doing basically is taking the sugar out and putting in these sweeteners, and saying, "Oh, we have reduced the amount of sugar in our products." And now we've introduced a whole other new element, very understudied and very misunderstood by the public in terms of how they are really affecting the body, and probably not doing us any favors.
That was surprising too, because I think a lot of things are sweetened with stevia, and it gives this label of, oh, it's so much healthier for you. You're doing, making a better choice by choosing stevia. And so I've been much more mindful of that. And I think you talk about how you still crave the sugar because you're getting it almost, and it's like a hollow sugar. You get it, but then your body doesn't actually receive the sugar. Is that how you describe it?
Pretty much that is the case, yeah. So what's happening is these compounds have one thing in common. They are powerful activators of sweet taste receptors, which exist not just in your mouth, but all throughout your body. Hundreds, thousands, some of them tens of thousands of times more powerful than regular sugar. Wow. And so what happens when those sweet taste receptors become activated is it's not just about the taste, it's about setting off a cascade of events. And one of those events is the body realizing, oh, sugar is coming in. And when the body knows that sugar is coming in, it will extract it out of the blood because high blood sugars are problematic. The body wants to try and keep blood sugars very stable. So with a sweetener, those receptors get activated, a message gets sent, hey, there's sugar coming in. So the body will extract the sugar out of the blood, but it wasn't there to begin with. So what's going to happen is your blood sugars will fall.
So you're saying, Michael, that basically the pancreas is turned on and insulin is then elaborated, and then the insulin will take what sugar is, the glucose in the actual bloodstream, and shove it into the cell. Is that correct? Is that how I should interpret that?
Yeah.
And then you crave more sugar.
And then, first, if you've ever been hypoglycemic, you're distressed and angry maybe and hungry, and just eat what the first thing that you set your eyes on, pretty much. So and studies have shown this in practice, that individuals who habitually consume sweeteners end up, over the course of a day or the course of a week, end up consuming more calories and more sugar.
That's a very important thing for us to know.
So we're really not doing yourself any favors. And it's, my advice is, rather than replace sugar with a sweetener that probably doesn't even taste as good, and we don't know what it's doing to the body, just use less sugar.
Yeah. And you said our research and our firsthand experience tell us that sugar is shortening our kids' lives. So what is this doing to our children, all this overconsumption?
Really, we can talk about any of the organs of the body and make a case of how sugar is affecting them. And it could be as straightforward as the tooth and dental decay, which is driven by excess sugar. And that's a developmental thing, because the tooth is not fully developed, so it doesn't have the enamel to protect it from the acid that's produced by the bacteria that are thriving on the sugar. So there's this cascade. But really, any of the organs of the body, the liver, the pancreas that you already mentioned, heart, gut, GI issues, and even brain development studies clearly showing that children who consume more liquid sugar from beverages tend to not do as well on standardized test scores. Wow.
And there's also the long game too that you're playing, is you mentioned some of these scary diseases that can pop up in your 50s, 60s, or 70s. How strong is that research with like consumption of sugar and those neurodegenerative diseases?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say. People would argue back, it's not. We don't have strong causation evidence, because you're going to have to do a study where you give a lot of sugar to a kid and then wait 50, 60 years and see what happens. It's not a study that can be done, right? It's just not feasible. But we do have what we call association studies, where we've looked at cohorts over time. We don't necessarily have studies that have made the link between consumption in childhood and cognitive decline at age 50, 60. But we do have studies among the elderly population that do show that both regular sugar and sweeteners are associated with a higher risk of cognitive decline, dementia, and Alzheimer's disease.
That's crazy to hear. So as I read this, I thought, okay, well, the only solution is you got to make a lot more food at home. I mean, you really have to commit to doing a lot more cooking and sourcing the ingredients well. Like my dad said, reading the back of the ingredients on packages. And so that's really what the change has triggered in me. But I would love to hear if you have one or two stories of the dramatic change that you've seen in patients when they've removed the high sugar diet.
Michael, can I interject here? Can you tell us the story of Marco? Marco was one of the names that you and his story. You might want to start with Marco.
Yeah, I forget which one Marco was.
He had the fatty liver.
Yeah, I remember he had the fatty liver, but I can't remember the outcome from.
Oh, was he the one that didn't appear overweight and he played on the football team, or well, yeah, choose whatever story. Or
yeah, I think Marco might have been in one of our studies where he came into one of our studies as a volunteer, and then he didn't know it, but we found out as part of our study that he had non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, and he was part of an intervention. And even though he knew and we knew he had fatty liver disease, it was still very difficult he was meeting with a dietitian on a regular basis as part of one of our programs to try and reduce sugar. And this story talks to the powerful addictive properties of sugar, because it was so difficult for us, even with him knowing that, working with our dietitian, to make any meaningful reductions in dietary sugar. So it's a story of how, when it gets extreme, it becomes harder to modify. But even though that was a story that didn't necessarily end out well for Marco, we have other stories where kids went off of sugar, and we've had a lot of success with our no added sugar challenge. We don't generally recommend zero sugar, except for our no added sugar challenge for 7 days. But what we've shown is that when you do it for 7 days, you're going to learn a lot about all the sources of added sugar in your kitchen and identify suitable alternatives. But we've had dramatic turnarounds in kids who weren't able to concentrate well in school because they were going out the door on a very high sugar breakfast. But when we stabilized that with lower sugars, we were able to stabilize their blood sugars and stabilize their concentration, and they reported doing much, much better at school. And they weren't kind of doing the mid-morning crash at 10:30.
Yeah, you had that example of tracking the teaspoons of sugar for that one family that didn't realize like how much sugar she'd already consumed by 11 a.m.
Right.
Yeah. I think that if I remember too, Marco was the guy who was playing football, and he was hanging out with his football buddies, and it was almost impossible for him to really hew to the diet, because he was he was surrounded by all of his friends who were out there having their hamburgers and Cokes, and that was a big issue for him. I think is one other little comment I picked up from your book, Michael, that I will interject here. You did a comparison between 1750, the year 1750, and today, and there was certainly sugar in the diet in 1750, but it was about 4 grams or 4 pounds per year, 4 pounds per year of sugar that an average person would ingest. That number has ballooned up to 150 pounds of sugar per year. Now, I do the math on that. That's darn near a half of a pound of sugar every day. And so I look at that and kind of go, whoa. And so I do think that the amount of availability of sugar from all these sources, beet sugar, sugar cane, of course. Obviously, the one thing I do think we need to touch on, you kind of briefly mentioned it, but there is a lot of money in the food industry, and I think the number you gave was the advertising budget is about $10 billion with a B dollars per year that is targeted to children. And I find that, and they've even done these studies, they call it the bliss point, the level of sweetness that they need to maintain to keep their sales high. Can you speak to this about the food industry and how they're, to a degree, they're subverting our health by looking at their bottom line?
For sure. Yeah. I mean, this has been pretty well documented by people like Michael Moss and others in his book, Salt, Sugar, Fat, this issue of the bliss point. And food companies know that, what I mentioned earlier, that kids have this built-in preference for sweetness. It's there to protect them in a way, to help them seek out good calories and avoid food that's spoiled. From an evolutionary perspective, you could imagine that being somewhat protective. But the food companies have somewhat exploited that, and they know that sweetness sells for kids. And that's why for kids' product, you mentioned 70% of processed foods have added sugars. For kids, it's 80%. So wow. 80% of foods targeted towards kids have added sugars, and they tend to be sweeter too. That's why apple juice keeps getting sweeter and sweeter, because sweetness sells. And then you can talk about the whole industry of formula transition milk story. these transition milks, which the American Academy of Pediatrics just came out with a report last week saying they were completely unnecessary. But food companies are using those types of products to easily transition from formula into transition milks into other products coming late, and all like with way too much sugar in there and not as much nutritional content. I think there's a lot we can talk about. It's unfortunately a hugely powerful, as you mentioned, the number in the billions of dollars of not just advertising, but also lobbying. And this is another reason why I wrote the book, because I think my strategy is to try and just get the word out and get people to recognize these issues and hopefully make changes in their own household diets and food selections.
Yes, I do think everyone should read the book, because you do the intro, what it's doing to our kids' bodies, and then you talk about the history of sugar and all the different types of sugar, and the low calorie sweeteners, so you can recognize it and be informed, and the history of it, the money and politics, and then you go into what we can do as families and parents, what we can start doing. And like you said, the no sugar challenge. But what is your 2 to 3 minute advice to young families? Like, really, what should we be? It's every day is this practice of not having sugar in our diet, and really making it part of your family culture.
Yeah, sure. I'm curious to hear what you did yourself when you started making changes. But really, I think over the years since we've published this book and talked to a lot of people, I think what we're seeing is a lot of people kind of get overwhelmed by it. Mm-hmm. So I want to just kind of make the point that not to get overwhelmed by it, and just you can make small, subtle changes from day to day, which over time will add up to a lot. You can start with liquid sugar is the biggest issue, I think. That doesn't mean to say your kids can never have soda or juice ever again. Just don't bring it into the house, for example. They're going to have it at parties and when they go out with their friends and all that. So that's one thing. Breakfast is another area. I think there's a lot we can do as parents. Breakfast is important for kids. Breakfast tends to be very high in sugar, but there's a lot of simple things you can do around breakfast time to tip the balance away from sugar and towards more fiber, more protein, which is going to be much better for stabilizing blood sugars. And there's simple things you can do there. And the third thing is just those hidden sugars that we mentioned earlier. Just become aware of that. That's just kind of think about the typical culprits like we mentioned, and there's lots of healthy products out there that, pasta sauce, peanut butter, yogurts are some typical examples that are common for kids. They don't have to have added sugar in them. There's plenty of options that are without added sugar. Maybe a struggle. You may have a little mini rebellion. I'm curious to hear, well, your kids are a little younger. But for some kids, I think parents will give up too easily, but they'll completely rebel against the peanut butter because it doesn't have any added sugars in it. But I think you just have to kind of persist. You can be sneaky with it too. There's ways to do that as well. So there's 3 things.
Yeah, those are great. Well, I sort of like that you didn't go easy on us as parents. You didn't sugarcoat it. You really were like, you need to make changes. And I am a believer that your palate can change. This is not so much about my kids as much as it's for me. I'm a total sweet tooth person. I love chocolate chips and this and that, and I just love sugar. And I've known about how sugar is not great for my body. So the past 10, 12 years, it's always been, I'm going to go no sugar for 2 weeks. I'm going to go no sugar for 4 weeks. And then I slide and whatever. And I have to say, your book is the first time. I think it was the scary factor. I think it was knowing what it was doing to my body that I I put myself on a 45 days of no added sugar. And your palate sort of goes, I don't want that as much anymore. I still love sugar. So there is hope that, if you've had the Skippy with added sugar for 10 years and then you cut it and then do the only peanut, ground peanuts, you can, train your body to really like that.
Yeah, it doesn't take 45 days. I mean, that's remarkable, and that you stayed that long. That's great. But the 7-day no added sugar challenge.
Yeah, there you go. 7 days. Start with 7 days. But I was an extreme case. I was always wanting sugar at the end of the day, and always looking forward to and then maple syrup. I would be like, "Oh, I'm sweetening it with maple syrup, so it's healthy for me." And you said in the book, sugar is sugar, whether it's honey or maple syrup. But so that was encouraging to know that you can make a little bit of a change. And to hear my dad say that he's looking at labels.
So yeah, Michael, I have to confess here. I'll jump in a little bit. Your book. I'm a pediatrician. I've been in practice for over 35 years, so I should know all this stuff. And I reading this and kind of go, I didn't know that. I didn't know that. And I have always eschewed the idea of reading labels. I thought that was a little bit too intense. Now I look at labels. Now I'm looking at extra sugar, added sugar, which is new. They have put that into labels, which I appreciate. But one of the things that and by the way, I'm sharing this with my patients too. I want you to know that it isn't only Dr. Bob is getting impacted. I am sharing a lot of these little comments to my patients, especially with my teenagers and other kids too. But for example, Coca-Cola, a 12-ounce can of Coca-Cola has 39 grams of added sugar. Now, I didn't know this, that there were 4 grams per teaspoon. I didn't know that. I should have known that. And when you do the math on that, that is 9 3/4 teaspoons of sugar in every 12 ounces of Coca-Cola. So I have brought this up to my parents in my practice, and they look and they go, "Really? Are you sure about that?" And I go, "I'm sure about that." And they go, "That's really gross." I go, "It is. It is really gross. I mean, you're just basically
grossness.
It is intense." And thank you for that illumination. This is something that, again, I should have known, but I didn't. I think also, if I'm watching our time here, we're going to have to finish in a minute here, but you talk about the Cliff Bar Challenge. Can you speak to that a little bit? Because this too was, I happen to like Cliff Bars. So maybe I'd like them a little bit less now, but can you talk about that challenge?
Yeah, it's, I don't want to pick on Cliff Bar, but I think it makes the point that it's not just about reading the food label these days. We have to look at the ingredient list. And I know that can be tedious, but I think if you're going to be eating something, you ought to know what's in it, right? So for that, you have to look at the ingredient list. And so we picked this example of this particular Cliff Bar because we counted, was it 7 or 8 different added sugars in this Cliff Bar. And so food companies are doing that now a lot because, and the reason they do it is because on the ingredient list, has to list ingredients in the order of content. So the ingredient that's the most, with the highest content, goes first. So now instead of Cliff Bar saying sugar as the first ingredient, they can put some other stuff and then bury sugar further down the list because it's broken down into 7 or 8 different smaller sugars. So it's really not just about the Cliff Bar, it's really about these 250 plus names of sugar that, some of them sound healthy again, like my favorite one might be organic brown rice syrup. It's organic, it's brown, and it's rice, so it has to be good.
True. You've been told all those things are good for you. But in the past,
corn syrup that's not made from corn. But chemically it's the same. It's a glucose syrup that's made from rice instead of corn.
Interesting. Well, the past 2 months, Luca and I have, my son and I've brought him into the kitchen and we've made tortillas from scratch, hamburger buns from scratch, bread, muffins. I know those are all like snacky type foods, but those are ingredients that normally I would have purchased. But once I've looked at what is in a hamburger bun, you're like, oh no, I don't want to bring that in. It's 6 grams of sugar per hamburger bun. That's crazy. So it's a little, if you can get over like you said, the fear of like, this is so overwhelming, and start making things from scratch and involving the kids. That's been fun for us.
I think it might be helpful just in your book. I'm going to read a couple. You have several names for sugars, and this is something that people maybe not, they always look for added sugar, but let me just read a handful of these sugars, which are sugars, but they're kind of, they're not maybe obvious. Okay. Agave nectar, apple juice concentrate, barley malt syrup, beet sugar, of course, obvious, blackstrap molasses, brown rice syrup. Okay. All these brown sugar, I always thought brown sugar was better for you than not. Caramel, that might be obvious. Carob sugar, coconut nectar, confectioner's sugar, corn syrup. And there are so many, dextrose. People don't know what that is. Galactose, glucose, of course, is just good old, sugar, but many people not know. Honey is up there too. Honey has got a lot of sugar in it. Maltose, maltol. And so you have mannose. And so all of these, I guess one thing we should tell people is anything with the suffix OSE is a sugar, right? And look for that little suffix on these different things, and that'll help you guide you in terms of identifying those hidden sugars.
Yeah.
There's a lot of them.
Yeah. And
a lot of them there. So listen, Michael Goran, I thank you for your knowledge and your beautifully written book. I guess to Emily Ventura as well. She was a co-writer in this book. And first of all, I want to, again, tell people the name of the book is called Sugarproof. The subtitle is Protect Your Family from the Hidden Dangers of Excess Sugar with Simple Everyday Fixes, written by Dr. Michael Goran and Dr. Emily Ventura. And I also want to say thank you to Emily, my daughter, for coming and helping in this conversation. Michael, how do people find you?
Best place would be Instagram. That's where we most frequently post almost daily, at Sugarproof Kids. That's where you find us on Instagram and Facebook. The book, Amazon or any other online seller will have the book. You can also check our website, sugarproofkids.com. And if you want to send me an email, hello@sugarproofkids.com.
I like
Write
that.
that down.
That's very nice. Okay, well, we're going to finish up right here. I just want to say to everyone listening, this is an important conversation. I think it's a point where we all, as parents, kind of stop and say, okay, what does the diet of our children look like? To some of us, is a little bit of a point of shame, I guess you would say, but it should cause everyone to at least think about what we're feeding our children and what we're feeding ourselves too. So, Dr. Michael Goran, thank you for taking the time to be on the Hamilton Review today. My daughter, Emily Benedetto, thank you also for taking the time to be here. It's been a great conversation. I wish you the very best in terms of getting the word out, Michael. You're doing good work.
Thank you so much. Thank you for what you're doing. And thank you, Emily. Good luck with your family and your adventures in the kitchen. I'm really inspired to hear all that. That's fantastic. And thank you for the conversation.
Yes.
Oh.
So friends, we're going to end it there. So thank you all for tuning in today to the Hamilton Review. Until next time, be well. Bye-bye.
You have been listening to the Hamilton Review, where kids and culture collide. Thank you for allowing us to be a part of your day. Tune in again next week on Apple Podcast. Rate and comment and tell a friend.